149 days ago, I decided to sell my base spec M2 Air to buy this base spec Space Black MacBook Pro. So this one does have the 18 gigabytes of RAM and 512 gigabyte hard drive, which for some reason the Space Black sits above the actual entry-level MacBook Pros that you can only get in silver or space gray. If anyone knows why Apple did it that way, let me know in the comments. But before this, I was using the Midnight M2 Air, which I have my wife's still right here. I ended up selling mine, but to do the comparisons, I wanted to have one to show you guys the difference. So hopefully by the end of the video, if you are on the fence trying to decide if you should get a MacBook Pro or the MacBook Air, you have enough information to see what the differences are and if you should get one or the other. So first things first, the design of the M3 MacBook Pro has not changed much since the introduction of the M1 Pro when Apple decided to go ahead and release their own silicon chips. You get a pretty similar design, which is now brought over to the MacBook Air lineup. On the left-hand side, you are going to go ahead and get your MagSafe along with your two Thunderbolts, and that is where the comparisons stop between these two devices. On the MacBook Pro, you are also going to be getting your headphone jack on the left-hand side, and on the right side, you're going to be getting your HDMI, another Thunderbolt port, along with your SD card slot. On the MacBook Air, on the right side, you're only going to be getting that 3.5mm headset jack. So if that is a concern to you, if you do a lot of stuff on the go and you want those ports, right away the MacBook Pro may be a better option. But if you are a desktop user like myself, 95% of the time I'm at my desk. And if you have a dock, or if you want to go ahead and get a dock, you're probably not going to notice the lack of ports between these devices because you can add as many ports as you'd like on the dock itself. The same goes for the display outputs. I know there are limitations on these MacBooks, especially on the M2, where you could only output to one external display. They fixed that on the M3, where you can now output to two, but you need to have the lid closed. However, you can fix that if you still get a DisplayLink supported dock. So really, there aren't too many differences between what you can support as far as monitor outputs on these devices. So moving on from the ports, we do have the dark colorway on both of these MacBooks, the Space Black on the MacBook Pro and the Midnight color on the MacBook Air. Now, if you look at these kind of side by side, the Midnight color does have more of a bluish hue to it. I would say in certain colors, it does tend to look more black than the Space Black, where I feel like that one is more of a deep dark gray. But the MacBook Air does tend to get quite a bit more fingerprints, and you can kind of see here, I intentionally did not wipe these down, so you can kind of see as I'm moving it around here. I'll give you a top-down shot as well. This is what these computers look like after a little bit of use. But if you're not someone who has a little bit of OCD, you're probably not going to care too much about those fingerprints anyway. Now, where you might start to see some more differences is in the displays. The MacBook Air is an IPS LED backlit display capable of 500 nits for its SDR peak brightness. The MacBook Pro is a mini LED display capable of 600 nits peak brightness for its SDR content. And while that may not seem like a lot, 100 nits is a decent amount, but that doesn't stop there because the MacBook Pro can also support HDR content up to 1600 peak nits or 1000 nits for its sustained brightness when viewing XDR content. So that's a pretty significant difference. On top of having a better screen for brightness and HDR content, you are also able to support ProMotion 120 on the MacBook Pro. But if you haven't had a 120Hz display, it's likely something you aren't going to miss too much, and the 60Hz display on the MacBook Air is going to be just fine. But these small differences in extra ports and display weren't the main reasons I started to look into making an upgrade. The biggest reason I decided to switch was because the M2 MacBook Air only has 8 gigabytes of RAM. When I started doing 4K exports for YouTube, I noticed there was a lot more memory getting pushed into swap. The M2 would get a little toasty and it would start to slow down due to throttling. So really, I started to find the limits of what the base spec M2 Air was capable of doing, and that is when I decided to go ahead and start to consider the M3 Pro. Initially, I had considered just upgrading the MacBook Air to one with 16 gigs of RAM, and with that, you get the 512 gigabyte hard drive. But the cost comes out to about $14.99 on Apple's website, and at the same time I was looking around, B&H was running a sale on this MacBook Pro I have here for $17.99, and I just actually checked their website today. They still have this MacBook for $17.99. So for a difference of only $300, you're getting a better display, you're getting more ports, you're getting 2 more gigs of RAM, you're getting a faster hard drive, and you get fans on your MacBook. So to me, that was the move to make, And it was. The additional RAM has made all the difference in the world between hitting swap all the time and now hardly at all. When doing a 4K export on YouTube, I'll use about 13 to 16 gigs of RAM, and only sometimes will it go over and I'll still touch swap, but at the same time this Mac does not get hot while doing it. I actually have yet to hear the fans come on this Mac at all. The additional power does mean you'll use your battery a little bit faster, so instead of all-day battery like you get on the MacBook Air, you may get a little bit less, but at the same time you're able to do a lot more with power-hungry applications on the MacBook Pro. And according to Apple's website, when it comes to video viewing, both of these are rated for 18 hours. When browsing around the web, you may get a little less on this because of that beefier CPU, but at the same time, I really haven't noticed too much of a difference. The MacBook Air definitely lasts longer when kind of casually browsing around, but it's not like you're going to end up dead in a couple hours with this one anyway. They still are at the top of their class for battery life, and it does last pretty much the entire day. But all these extras do come with added weight. The MacBook Pro is almost a full pound heavier than the MacBook Air. You may not notice when you're picking it up and putting it in your backpack, but if you are lifting it with one hand like I just was there, you notice that extra pound on your wrist quite a bit. So when I am picking this up, it's a lot easier to just reach for the MacBook Pro with two hands versus quickly grabbing the Air with one, and you can kind of toss it around. It's super light. And that's really the only downside I can think of when it comes to having had this now for the last 149 days, if you can even call it a drawback. There's really nothing else I miss about the MacBook Air aside from having maybe a little bit lighter machine, but like I said before, I use it 95% of the time at my desk, so I'm not really noticing the weight difference much at all. And sure, I could have spent more money to get 36 gigs of RAM on the M3 Pro, or fully upgraded to the M3 Max and even more RAM, but at the same time, I'd be spending $700, $1,000, $1,500 more, and I feel like I would much rather spend that on getting a new MacBook Pro in 3 or 4 years versus having one now that's still going to be outdated in 3 or 4 years. So to me, this machine right here is the perfect balance of cost and performance, and if you're on the fence of whether or not you need a MacBook Pro or a MacBook Air, I think the question you need to ask yourself is, am I going to be doing a lot of video editing or rendering where I'm going to need the extra performance? And if not, you're likely going to be fine with the MacBook Air. But I would still recommend getting 16 gigabytes of RAM if you can, because it just makes more sense. So for me, living with this MacBook Pro over the last 5 months has been nothing short of fantastic. From its top-notch build quality to its price to performance ratio, I feel like I'm getting a lot of Mac for my money and that it's going to last me a long, long time, which is exactly what I had hoped for.